Hey, what's going on everyone? My name is Benjamin Nowak and this is the Smallmouth Experience, and in today's video we're going to talk about tube fishing, and this is something that I've gotten a ton of requests to do, and I think with the waters opening up here in the north where a tube really plays for big smallmouth bass, it makes sense that I'm getting a lot of these recommendations for this specific video. Now the thing is, and one thing you hear me mention a bunch, is that this is not necessarily a numbers bait. Like if you want to pick an area apart and just catch a bunch of fish, I would actually recommend throwing something like a Ned rig where you can cast it out and see if fish are there. But on areas where you know big smallmouth are living, big smallmouth, this is a great bait because you can take a tube and you can fish it really slowly through an area and draw some of those bigger than average bites. Throw a Ned rig if you just want to get bit, and throw a tube if you want to catch the biggest fish that live in the area. And that's what makes a tube so effective, is its ability to draw those big bites from giant smallmouth bass. And another really cool thing is it works north to south, east to west. Anywhere that you guys are fishing, a tube will catch fish. Largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass. A tube is a great bait because it can imitate a variety of different forages, whether you're fishing around some sort of bait fish like perch, shiners, shad, whatever sort of bait fish you're fishing around, you can use it to imitate that. It imitates crawfish really well, and it imitates one of the main smallmouth forage types over probably the past 10 years up here in the north on the Great Lakes and all of our northern lakes. Gobies. A lot of giant smallmouth get really fat because they feed up on gobies, and a tube is a great way to imitate a goby crawling or scooting along there on the bottom. So it's just a really good bait to imitate a variety of different forage types, and it catches a lot of really big fish. The way I want to break down this video is start by talking about when I'm fishing it, talk about where I'm fishing it, and then we'll move into the how, we'll move into the gear, we'll move into the retrieves. So start by talking about where I'm fishing this bait. And typically I'm fishing it around transitional bottom composition areas. So what I'm looking for is like a sand to rock transition, gravel to big boulders, or one of my favorite places is a sand to sand grass transition. So up here in the north we have this stuff called perch grass or sand grass, and it's a really short growing grass. Typically it doesn't grow more than like a foot tall off the bottom, and it's a great place for smallmouth to sit, is on those transitional edges. And on those bottom composition changes, a lot of the smallmouth will sit there, kind of use it as a wall to sit against, because unlike largemouth they don't tend to get in it, they'll use the edges of it. And those composition changes are a great place to ambush bait fish, gobies, crawfish, or other forage types as they swim by or as they scoot by. What makes sandgrass so good though is its ability to allow you to fish the bait differently to get a reaction strike. So as you're pulling that bait, you're pulling that tube through the sandgrass and it gets hung up just a little bit, bogged down, and you snap that bait free. That tube scoots out, pops out backwards like a crawfish or like a fleeing bait fish, and it elicits that reaction strike from that smallmouth that's sitting in the sand. So as you're pulling it through that little bit of grass, as you're fishing it around that grass and you hit that bait and it comes free, that's when you get a lot of your bites. So I really like to fish it around that area. One, it's like a natural ecosystem. I talk about this a lot when I talked about largemouth. Grass just tends to hold bait fish and hold basically everything that an ecosystem needs to thrive, and it also gives a really good opportunity for you to get a reaction bite from those fish that are sitting on the edges of the grass. So what I'm looking for are transitional bottom composition areas. I'm looking for areas where the bottom composition physically changes. Where I don't typically fish a tube is on hard contour changes, where there's a hard drop off or a hard break, because a lot of times those are very bait fish oriented locations. The bass will kind of sit there and then move once the bait fish moves, and it's not a good bait to cover a lot of water with. Like, this is not something that I'm throwing around to cover water. So on those composition changes, when those fish tend to be really pelagic or nomadic following bait fish, I don't pick up tube. I'll pick up a crankbait, I'll pick up a swim bait, something that I can cover water with, but a tube isn't really my go-to there. It's those bottom composition changes when I know fish are living there and you want to get that big bite, that's when I'm picking up a tube. Now, when am I going to be fishing this bait? I have a tube tied on in some variety all year long. Now, I have a dedicated tube rod and a spinning setup, but I'm also going to throw it on a bait casting setup with a couple different retrieves, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But I'm going to be fishing a tube all year long. So I want to sort of talk about my progressions on how I'm choosing the cadence or the method that I'm using to fish the tube, because there are a couple different ways that I fish this. Now, one of the most famous or popular versions or ways to fish a tube currently is called cracking a tube. Now, I'm not going to go too much in depth on how to crack a tube. The guy that basically invented it, the guy that is the promoter of this. His name is Mark Zona. Mark Zona is one of the best smallmouth fishermen. He has a great video breaking down how to crack a tube, and I'm going to leave that linked up here in the corner for you guys. So go check out that video on how to crack a tube, because it's a great way to draw bites, and that's a technique that will work all year long. Spring, summer, winter, fall is cracking a tube. Kind of breaking down, though, how I personally like to fish a tube, I'm going to break it down by season. So in the spring, when those fish are really aggressive, I'm going to fish it by cracking a tube or hopping a tube. Very rarely in the early spring, when those fish are pre-spawn, I'm going to drag a tube. And the reason for this is a lot of times those fish are aggressive. They're looking for some sort of reaction bite. They're looking for something that's moving and scooting along. They're looking to get fat as quickly as possible, and something that has an aggressive movement gives those fish an opportunity to kind of elicit a reaction bite and feed up on that tube as it scoots by. So very rarely in the early spring am I dragging this bait, but once those fish start to move up on bed, sort of like that 58-degree mark to about 65 degrees, I'm going to drag a tube. It's going to be one of my most predominant methods of fishing a tube. It's just turning my rod to the side and dragging it. And the reason for that is a lot of times you're catching fish, big smallmouth, on beds that you're not seeing, out in 10 foot of water, 12 foot of water. And dragging a tube allows you to get those fish to bite. It's also a really good time to catch big post-spawn and late pre-spawn smallies that are kind of like in that in-between stage where they're not really on bed or committed, and they're not really post-spawn looking to feed up, and dragging a tube, kind of just pulling it by their nose, is a really good way to elicit a bite. So early spring, I'm going to be moving that bait a lot, hopping it, cracking it, and then as we move into the spawn, I'm going to start dragging that tube and really being slow and methodical. As we move through the summer, I'm going to sort of kind of vary my retrieve. This is the time of year where you can fish a bunch of different retrieves with the tube and be really effective. Because some days, on those high pressure days, you're going to have to drag it really slow. But on those lower pressure days, when there's a little bit of wind on the water and chop, and those fish tend to be a little bit more aggressive, you can hop it and get a lot of big bites that way. But for me, the summer is the time when it's the hardest to fish a tube, because it's the hardest to really dial in how those fish want it. This is also where fishing a tube on a bait caster is going to come into play. Fishing a tube on a bait caster, for me, is a very specific method of fishing a tube that I call cracking a tube or stroking a tube. A lot of times this is done in that 15 foot of water plus range, and what I'll do is I'll take a big 3/4 or 1 ounce head, depending on the depth that I'm fishing, and just like what you would do with stroking a jig on the ledges, I do that with a tube. I'll put that big head inside of one of the tubes, and it takes a little bit of time, so I'm not going to do it. But you take that big football head jig and you push it up into a tube, and I'll stroke that jig off that tube, or stroke that tube off of that ledge or off that rock pile. And the biggest key there is you're looking for a reaction strike. These fish, their metabolism's sped up, they're looking to feed, they're in those deep summer areas, and stroking a tube can be a really good way when they're looking for those bait fish out deeper. That bait comes up by them, falls back down, and that's when you're going to get a lot of your bites, is on that fall. So fishing a bait caster on a tube, that's something I like to do during the summer, really stroking that tube on deep water areas, shoals, reefs, rock piles where you know those big fish are at. Stroking the tube can be a really good way to get those fish to bite. Like I said, it's a big 3/4, 1 ounce head, depending on the depth, and I'm fishing it on a heavy gear setup, which we'll talk about here once we move into the gear. Now as we move into the fall, those fish tend to push on those little bit shallower rock piles, those little bit shallower rock bars. Basically the springtime method again. I want to keep that tube moving, cover in water for the most part, unless you get super high pressure days. But during that fall time, this is the time when you can catch those giants. So this is when I really like to pull out a tube versus a lot of other bottom baits, because it draws a lot of big bites. So drag that tube, hop that tube, it doesn't really matter in the fall. As long as you have the fish like dialed in, this is a great technique to catch giants. My buddy Shredder has actually caught like 28 pounds a couple of years ago with me. He was like the main proponent of that giant bag, throwing a tube, and he was just slowly dragging it along. Super high pressure day when nothing else would get bit. That tube caught some absolute giants. Then during the winter time, this is the only time of year where I'll opt for like a blade bait or something with a little bit less movement than a tube typically has. So the winter is like the only time I won't really dedicate some time to the tube, or maybe not even have a tube tied on. So now let's start to talk about how I'm throwing this bait. And we already really touched on stroking the tube. So you know the big football head, 3/4 ounce to 1 ounce head, and then I'm throwing it on a bait casting rod. This is a Temple Fork Outfitters 7.3 heavy rod. It's a 736, and I like something between 7 and 7.5 foot long. I want to be able to make a long cast, and that heavy power is going to help you basically handle those bigger heads. This will handle that 1 ounce size with no worries. It's basically my offshore jig rod, so it's going to work perfect when I'm fishing that big single jig hook in that tube. So 7.3 heavy power rod, Lew's Tournament Pro G reel with 17-pound test fluorocarbon line. I like fluorocarbon on my bait casting rods. You can go braid to fluoro, but I would definitely recommend having some sort of fluorocarbon directly connected to that tube. The other big thing here, that 17-pound test is nice because I'm fishing it around rocks a lot, so I like that little bit heavier pound test. Fishing it in deep water, and a lot of times I'm fishing this just like I would fish a jig or a wobblehead. This is the same wobblehead rod that I was using, and it just flat out catches fish. Moving into my spinning rod setup, which is what I'm predominantly using for tube fishing. It's a 7.3 medium heavy Temple Fork Outfitters rod. Now, one thing that's unique about this 735 is that it actually runs in between a medium and a typical traditional medium heavy. So it's not a true medium heavy and it's not a true medium, and I like that because it allows that rod to load up really well when I'm cracking a tube or dragging a tube. And when I set the hook on those fish, I'm not like straightening out moderately light wire tube hooks. So I like sort of a medium or medium heavy, something between 7 and 7.5 foot long. I want to be able to make a long cast, get that tube away from the boat, especially in clear water situations, but have the ability to set the hook into those fish from a long ways out and trust this single jig hook is going to get in their mouth. So having that 7.3 medium heavy is really, really nice. Now I'm trying out throwing this on straight fluorocarbon. This is something I might change. I actually like it so far. I basically underspooled the reel a little bit, put some line conditioner on there, and it's worked out perfectly. It's 8-pound test fluorocarbon line, but something I ran last year and have run on all of my other spinning reels is braid to fluorocarbon. I'll run 15-pound test braid to an 8-pound test fluorocarbon line with a long leader, like a 30-foot leader. The key there is basically giving yourself more fluorocarbon that has a little bit more stretch, so when you set the hook you're not like snapping your line. So I like a long leader basically on all of my spinning rod braid to fluorocarbon connections. Another key is actually a high-speed gear ratio reel. One thing with smallmouth, when they eat a tube, they'll typically pick it up and come towards you. So this is a Team Lew's Pro Custom reel. It's a 6:2 to 1 gear ratio. So that higher speed gear ratio is going to give you the ability to pick up line really quickly when those fish are coming to you, and keep that fish pinned, especially when you're fishing a tube where it's just a single jig hook. So a high-speed gear ratio reel is something that's really important for most of my smallmouth techniques. So now let's move into the jig heads that I'm throwing, because I keep this actually relatively simple, whether or not it's going to sound like it here. But there's two style of jig heads that I like to throw. If I'm fishing a 1/4 ounce or less, I like just your standard tapered jig head. I like this because most times if I'm fishing a 1/4 ounce, I'm fishing shallow water. I'm probably fishing around some sort of grass, because a lot of times in shallow water, that's where you're going to have a lot of your grasses. So this is going to keep the head of that tube really narrow. So this tapered style jig head is going to come through the grass better. It's going to give it actually that better erratic action. When you pull this bait, it's going to allow it to kind of flutter down, kind of make that S or swimming motion on the fall. So 1/4 ounce or less, I'm going to your standard tapered style jig head. When I get into that little bit heavier sizes, like 3/8 ounce or heavier, I'm going to either this Bite Me big dude head, I believe, or a football head style jig. The reason for this is kind of twofold. One, it's actually a very much better profile for a goby. And two, what I found is that it comes through rock and cover a lot better. Because that head is a little bit bigger, it doesn't want to get bogged down or caught up into the rocks as well. And in that deeper water, when I'm fishing it around rocks or some sort of transitional areas, that bigger head will keep this bait from getting lodged in the rocks as easily. Now, one of my favorite places to fish that big stroking tube is when I'm on those offshore reefs and rock piles. So fishing a football head in that jig is going to bulb that head out on that jig and prevent it from getting snagged as much, especially with a heavy tube jig where it's going up and falling down really hard. You want to fish that bigger head because you don't lose quite as many tubes. Moving into colors, and I keep color selection basically on all of my baits really, really simple. I have basically a brown with purple and orange flake. This is from Cruncher Baits and it's called the Shiz. All-time favorite tube color, 98% of the time, I mean almost all of the time, this is my favorite tube color to throw. Basically it's a green pumpkin, purple orange flake with some white like speck in there. The Shiz or Toad Teaser from Cruncher Baits is the absolute deal. It is my all-time favorite color, and that is my number one. Now if I'm going to a clearer style body of water and know those fish are keying in on some sort of perch, I will go to a more melon-based tube. Now this is the KVD Strike King Coffee tube. This is the KVD Kick color, so it's basically a lighter like watermelon or cucumber base with some silver goldish flake in there. Looks really good coming in the water. It's actually a lot more translucent than your standard green pumpkin based tube. Just catches fish a little bit better in that cleaner water situation. And then finally, when I go up to northern Michigan where I know those fish are keying in specifically on crawfish, I'll go to a crawfish based style tube, an orange colored base tube with a little bit of green and orange flake in there. Looks like most of the crawfish that we have up here in the Midwest, and especially during the middle of that summer when they get that kind of light orange color with that green, this color works wonders. I actually don't know the name of this color. So what this color is basically an orange base with some orange flake, black flake, and green flake. I believe in the coffee tubes it's called Crazy Craw, but I'll have some more information down in the description below for you guys to check out as far as the tube colors goes and jig heads. And that's really my tube fishing setup. If you guys have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comment section below. If there's any other videos that you guys would like to see, again, let me know in the comment section because I love to take your suggestions and make those videos for you guys. If you're not already, please hit that subscribe button down below. As always, thank you for watching. Take care, Ted Lines. God bless. Pursue your passion.